Thanks for coming to check out our talk, Close Encounters of the Advanced Persistent Kind, Leveraging Rootkits for Post-Exploitation. We'll have some introductory slides to explain a bit more about rootkits and then specifically about the one we've been developing for our team. You can see some information about us. We both work at IBM X-Force's Adversary Services team, doing red teaming or research and development in function of red teaming engagements for our clients. So we just have some introduction slides to frame this discussion a little bit and talk about rootkits that use vulnerable drivers specifically as part of their workflow. So if you look at these two categories, right, old money and new money, as I like to call them, you have threat actors that are state-sponsored, like Turla, Equation, Lazarus, and so forth. And the new money, they're ransomware groups, right? That's where all the money is these days in ransomware. And both of these groups have documented cases of using vulnerable drivers for post-exploitation. However, the main difference between these is that, of course, state-sponsored actors are bringing much more advanced and capable tools to endpoint compared to ransomware actors, right? But one thing to keep in mind about this is that state-sponsored actors are obviously doing this for a much longer time. I think, for example, Turla has documented cases going back to 2012, whereas ransomware actors, we're maybe talking 2017 or later, right? So that doesn't necessarily forecast like good things if we look forward like 5 years or 6 years. So once we've decided on using vulnerable drivers for our rootkit, the question is like, how can you get those drivers loaded on endpoint? And there's a few different ways to do that. Like if we look at Project Zero trends, we can see in the wild O-Day use is just up year by year. It's not going down or leveling off. So that would be a way to get your rootkit loaded, right, with the 0-day. And just two things about this graph. A lot of these bugs are either because a new attack surface is discovered, and so a lot of researchers pile on, and then a bunch of 0-days drop out at the end of that. Or a vendor patches a vulnerability but fails to do appropriate variant analysis, and so same story, researchers find those related bugs, right? And a good example of this is over the last 2 years, we've had many bugs related to CLFS on Windows for privilege escalation, like 10 or something like that, not the actual number, I don't know, 12 maybe. So if you don't have a 0-day, what about N-day to load your vulnerable driver? And then what we need to think about is like, what's the average patch time for vulnerabilities? And you can see like in the bottom right, you have 16 days for high and critical and 151 days for medium and low. Now this is average, right? So in your corporate environment, probably like your finance department, they have automatic updates turned on, so they have no lag time, but you also have systems that run like business critical applications, which probably have more lag time. So there's a lot of variance. And you can see common reasons that people report that there is a lag in patch time on the slides. Right. And so here we have an example of an N-day that Valentina and I exploited earlier this year in the ancillary function driver, or AFD. And because of insufficiently checking data, user supplied data, it was possible to write a semi-controlled value to a kernel address. And it was relatively easy to turn that primitive into a fully functioning exploit. And the reason I bring this up here is because it took us only 24 hours to diff the patch, find the vulnerability, and write the exploit. So at that point, you're well within this 16-day average patch time for N days, right? Okay, so what if you don't have O day, you don't have N day? Then you can start to think about admin to kernel, right? And usually, people are very dismissive of that, and of course, Microsoft doesn't consider admin to kernel a security boundary, but I think this is a mistake, right? Personally, just my opinion, that this is a mistake because as we know, like home users are running in the context of a user that has admin access, and in a corporate environment, we can see something like this here, where an attacker breaches the Active Directory environment at some point, right? And then later in the attack lifecycle, they elevate their privileges in AD. And this is an if, right? Not when. This is going to happen, something that I can see from the work we do on our team, right? And then at that point, the attacker can access other machines in AD as admin that they've never touched before, enabling things like lateral movement using rootkits or persistence, again, using rootkits in memory, like on long-running servers. Okay, so you may wonder, like, what's the reason to actually operate in kernel space versus user space? And there's just some simple reasons that I highlight here, right? Like some mitigations only exist in user land, so you don't have to deal with them if you're operating in the kernel. And as we know, like EDR has become hyper-specialized. I think if you ask any people who are doing red teaming work here at the conference, they'll tell you that over the last few years, the capabilities of the EDR products have increased by quite a lot. But this specialization hasn't extended into kernel or not to the same degree. And then if we do a cost analysis, you know, whatever, like in billable hours, if a capability survives longer in the kernel than in user land, then it makes sense to invest in that. And finally, like the kernel is complex and undocumented in many ways. And so writing detections could be difficult, or they might be brittle, or they might incur unacceptable performance costs, right? Okay, so here we can see our fancy full chain lifecycle diagram, but it's pretty easy. Like, do you have admin? Do you have O day or N day? Then you can load your driver, and then blind OS and EDR telemetry. If you don't, then you go next, right? You're not at this stage to use that capability. There are just some things to think about. Since we're using signed vulnerable drivers, we need to make sure that our driver is not part of some block list or isn't signatured by vendors. And additionally, if the endpoint has some security mitigations enabled, like virtualization-based security, we need to think about if some of the capabilities in our rootkit can't be used at that point, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, and then we can see just like the core features of the rootkit. We obviously don't have time to go into all of these, but we'll touch on a number of these during the rest of the talk. So there's telemetry manipulation to decrease signal. There are more general capabilities like manipulating user land processes, patching data structures and stuff. And then modules which are generally driver-based, which can do a variety of things like interact with the file system or with hardware devices or on the network stack. Okay, and then we'll get into the tradecraft. Yes, so the first thing I want to talk about is just callbacks and ETW. And so AV and EDR products need telemetry, right, to do some magic heuristics and surface alerts. Now, over time, Microsoft has narrowed the ability for third-party vendors to do like crazy stuff in the kernel, right? PatchGuard is a good example of that. So to prevent vendors from hooking everything or what have you. But of course, they provide built-in mechanisms to allow these vendors to get data that they need to surface those alerts, like callback and ETW. Yeah, just one note about OPSEC here. It's always better to reduce or subtly manipulate telemetry than to eliminate it, just because that may create signal as well. Then here for callbacks, you have your usual suspects: image, process, thread, registry, and object. Like the object one specifically might be a bit confusing, but that is related to process and thread, process, thread, and desktop related handle activity, where you can receive a callback, a pre and post activity. Here, we see how we could leak these, but generally you leak a public symbol from the kernel module, which you can do, like in userland. And then using a KSLR leak, you can find where that exists in memory, and then do some pattern scanning to find the lists of these callbacks. You can see an example here for process notification routines, where we get an array of pointers for these callbacks, and then we can, manipulate that array to remove one from the list. Or as you can see, these callbacks call some function, so you could rewrite that function in memory. Then kernel ETW. So here we do something similar. We scan the kernel image on disk to find instances where calls happen to ETW register. And we can do that. That's not like a technical problem. Once we have those relative offsets, we can again use KSLR leak to find out where those calls happen in live kernel memory. And then by analyzing the arguments of those calls, we can find out where those registration structures exist in kernel memory, right? And those are the green boxes, ETW, reg entry. And those are basically big structures that have nested substructures as well, like ETW GUID entry and trace enable info. So if we look again here you can see an example of our rootkit dumping, this data for Microsoft Windows Threat Intelligence, or ETWTI, as people usually call that. And we can see that we can overwrite like the registration entry, so to null that out, or the GUID entry. But the better technique here, I think, is to manipulate this trace enable info structure, since we can modify how that provider works, right? Like we can set is enabled to 0 to turn it off, or we can reduce the level from FF to something less, so less events are captured, or change the keywords so that we selectively neuter some of the events that are being recorded. Okay, and then remember we had these 3 scenarios about loading your rootkit. And so here we have a demo where we're using a 0-day, thanks to my wonderful colleague Valentina, to elevate privileges, load our rootkit, and do this ETW manipulation. So here we're on Windows 11 22H2, fully up to date. I mean, patches were installed like on the 14th, I guess. Okay, we just check that we're running in a low integrity context or medium integrity context. Then we exploit our 0-day and load our signed vulnerable driver into memory. And then at that point, we can leverage the capabilities of our rootkit. Here, for example, we enumerate the ETW providers, and then Just for demonstration purposes, I'm just overriding the last one here in the list to set is enabled to 1, so I can turn it on if I want. And I'm setting the keywords to some arbitrary value, in this case just a bunch of A's, just to show you that we can override that in memory. All right, good. I'll hand it over now to Valentina.
So just a quick note about our disclosure policy, so our lawyers don't get mad at us. We demoed loading our rootkit with a 0-day, which I would love to talk about, but it's not patched yet. And in any case, this talk is more focused on post-exploitation techniques, and we don't have time. But as soon as it's patched, there'll be a follow-up blog post, of course. Continuing on with tradecraft, there are many types of robust methods to detect keyloggers, probably most or all types of keyloggers that are publicly known. The first type of keyloggers are user mode keyloggers that kind of come in 2 different forms. So the first type is native hooking keyloggers, installing low-level keyboard hooks. And these can be easily detected by just enumerating where there are hooks on keystrokes. And the second type is polling keyloggers, and they get keystroke information by making repeated calls to NT functions, like get async key state, which can be detected by monitoring which processes are making those system calls. And detecting those calls can be done in a variety of ways. It can be done by function hooking, ETW tracing, call stack unwinding, and I'm sure there's more. And in kernel mode, you usually see keyboard filter drivers. Keyboard filter drivers will create a device and attach the device to the actual physical keyboard device. And it will receive keystrokes via IO IRP when the real keyboard device does. These are also easy to detect because all you have to do is enumerate what keyboard devices there are and if there are devices attached to them. And hiding the driver becomes a little bit more difficult because the driver is now part of a driver stack receiving these keystrokes. So just simply unlinking it and hiding it in different ways does disrupt functionality. So let's think about a better way that's much harder to detect. I came across this method while investigating ways to make the most stealthy keylogger. And I started by reverse engineering the get async to key state function, which is what polling user mode keyloggers will do. They'll query it to obtain key states. It's pretty short, simple function. This compilation's on the screen. All it does is query this a couple of global keystroke tables. The main one is called GAF async key state, and it returns the results to the caller. You'll also notice that there's an ETW trace point there, which goes back to my previous point about detecting callers. One of the major ways malware evades EDR is by foregoing calls to the higher level API calls from kernel 32 or user 32 that are usually hooked or monitored more than the lower level NT system calls directly. But still, you can't really evade being detected if you're calling those functions because there's ETW trace points. Unless you, of course, employ the technique that my colleague spoke about earlier about blinding ETW callbacks. So we can implement this keylogger without calling into that API by reading the global kernel keystroke table directly. And keylogging in this way is actually super easy. It's much more simpler than writing a keystroke filter driver, for example, all that's necessary is to locate the pointer to this global table. In Windows 10 and earlier, it's exported in the driver Win32K base. On Windows 11, it moved, and it's not exported, but it's also pretty straightforward to find the address as well. So all that's really necessary at this point is to map the physical page of the global keystroke table array to a user mode virtual address. And you can pull that user mode memory in ring 3, just like you would your run-of-the-mill user mode keylogger, except you don't need to make those repeated system calls over and over. So not only can you avoid detection by not making those system calls, you're also very efficient for performance because you're avoiding all of those context switches calling into the kernel that can be costly. And you have to do it every single time you want to query the state of a keystroke. So it's not very efficient. So another capability that we have implemented is feature flag manipulation. Feature flags are a component of Windows that toggle various functionalities and also experiments. There are a lot of undocumented feature flags to toggle functionalities. Some examples include tabs in File Explorer. The Win32K driver in Rust is toggleable by a feature flag, as recently announced by Dave Weston at Blue Hat IL. And they can also toggle patches for vulnerabilities. In recent Windows Insider Preview editions, there's a feature flag for the ability to leak kernel addresses via the NT Query System Information APIs. And they are used for a lot of different things within Windows. So as you can see, a feature flag can influence a wide variety of system and application behavior. And manipulating their state is pretty useful for post-exploitation purposes. Here's an example of a feature flag implementation. This one is for a patch for a recent remote code execution vulnerability in MSMQ queue messaging system. The vulnerability was dubbed queue jumper. You can see here that the code queries the state of the feature, whether it's enabled or not. And if it's enabled, the patched saved code path will be executed. But if it's disabled, the vulnerable old code path will be executed. And this is just one example of an application querying and using feature flags to significantly modify their runtime behavior. You might be familiar with some tools that enable you to do feature flag manipulation from user space. Some examples are Vive or Mach2. Internally, these tools call WinAPI functions, some undocumented, some not, to change the feature flag configurations. However, there are limitations. You still need to have elevated access, and even with elevated access, it's still not permitted to change certain types of features, which include security features or image override features during runtime. But by modifying the configuration state in kernel memory, we can totally bypass those restrictions and toggle on and off those features as we please. So the actual technique to do this, there's a global kernel object named CMF System Manager that stores handles to sections and virtual address mappings that are tables to the feature flag configurations. So we can change their state by directly overwriting the tables in memory. Currently, we don't have an operational use case for this capability, but if you use your imagination, there are many things where this can potentially be useful for post-exploitation red teaming. Some possibilities include leaving open backdoors in vulnerabilities, which might be useful for persisting as low privilege and then exploiting, or misattribution, obfuscating attribution, revealing more attack surfaces, collecting or stopping telemetry, or much more. With feature flag use that's been growing a lot in the last recent years, but in particular the last 4 months, I would say, we'll probably begin to see and discover a lot of post-exploitation uses for feature flag manipulation. Another benefit of operating in the kernel is that we have complete control over networking. This gives us the ability to filter, drop, intercept, or manipulate what goes in and out of the network. WinDivert is a great example of an open source driver that offers robust and easy to use network filtering capabilities. You can filter based on IP, port, process, and more. And this has a number of operational use cases, such as dropping, intercepting, or manipulating EDR telemetry, traffic relaying, such as SMB relaying, or covert persistence. Just a few examples. And you might be wondering about driver payloads in general. So for example, WinDivert is a signed driver, so there's no issues loading it. But you might be wondering about what if your driver's not signed? So those methods, there are some options including patching code integrity, or loading your driver in memory. And those methods are blocked by certain mitigations if you have them turned on. Another thing is that you don't necessarily need to load a driver to do these direct kernel object manipulation techniques. If you have a kernel vulnerability that gives you read-write access to the kernel, then you don't actually need kernel code execution to begin with to do them. Also, you can also sign the driver legitimately if you have a certificate or use a leaked or expired certificate. So Windows currently suffers from a vulnerability that considers expired certificates from before 2015 as valid. So you can use those to sign a driver as long as the certificate hasn't been revoked. So here's a demo of us doing network filtering manipulation. Here you can see that a connection is being established with a particular IP address. This is before loading our driver or loading a networking filtering tool. This is just demonstrating the origin of the IP address, which is from CrowdStrike, as we can tell from the certificate. And now we're going to load our networking manipulation module and give it the rule to drop all CrowdStrike traffic. And so now that after this has been executed, nothing from CrowdStrike can get in or out, so CrowdStrike does not get endpoint telemetry. As my colleagues stated earlier, it's more beneficial to intercept and manipulate telemetry data versus just blocking it all together, because that also can generate an alert, but that is also possible using this method. So lastly, for techniques, a variety of user land manipulation can be done with the kernel rootkit, of course. This includes handle duplication, changing the protections on a process, and shellcode injection into a user-space process. And this manipulation can be done in various ways. We don't have time to cover all of them, but it's straightforward. If you have the ability to execute kernel code, you can just mirror what the Windows OS does legitimately. And so this is a nice segue into the next topic, which is virtualization-based security. I'm sure at some point in this talk, you might have had the thought that, well, okay, what about these mitigations, virtualization and hardware mitigations that Windows has been working hard at implementing in the recent years? Surely that will block all or most of the techniques that we've discussed today. So let's talk about it. First, let's talk about what virtualization-based security is. Virtualization-based security consists of a set of mitigations that use hardware virtualization and the Windows hypervisor to create an isolated environment that becomes the root of trust. It assumes that the kernel can be compromised. It is specifically intended to weaken kernel exploits and rootkits. And the most relevant of those mitigations, it doesn't include all of them, it's just a group of mitigations, but the ones that I chose to discuss below are kernel data protection, hypervisor protected code integrity, HVCI, and HyperGuard, which is like the original patch guard, but using the secure hypervisor. So with all of these virtualization-based mitigations, how are we actually restricted? In actual absolute terms. We can still do the majority of DKOM data-only techniques since many kernel structures aren't protected by PatchGuard or kernel data protection. Where we're really actually restricted is in loading drivers or unsigned kernel code. With HVCI enabled, you can't load unsigned drivers, and even drivers that are legitimate and signed, if they have self-modifying code, like sections with read, write, execute permissions, it will not be permitted to be loaded, even if it's legitimately signed. However, we do still have kernel code reuse techniques. So we can call arbitrary kernel functions and even register kernel callbacks, which I'll cover shortly. Really, the ultimate restriction is that we can't load unsigned drivers or call a continuous chunk of kernel code, but we can still execute code in the kernel. So here's a couple of powerful techniques to bypass kernel code execution restrictions imposed by VBS. The first is thread context manipulation, where the thread context return address, if you make the thread alertable, then you can change the address where it will resume execution, and you can pick an arbitrary kernel function for that. The next one, which is arguably more powerful right now, is called page swapping or page remapping. The page swapping technique relies on the fact that kernel data protection does not protect how the virtual address that maps a protected page is translated. Any protected region can be remapped. So it's possible to modify a page table so that the virtual address to some protected data will point to a physical page that is not protected and then write to the protected virtual address afterwards. A cool implementation of this technique was recently published in a blog post by researcher Wang, aka Sepia, where he modifies a service dispatch table, which holds pointers to system call functions. And this is really useful because parameters are all controllable from user space. And since Windows doesn't have SMAP, supervisor memory access protection, you can pass in user mode pointers that were only intended to functions that were only intended to process kernel mode pointers. So this allows us to easily call any kernel function we want. There's no need to load a driver, and therefore HVCI is never actually an issue. The only limitation is that you can't do chain calls, so calling one kernel function into another, but that's a limitation that can be easily dealt with. And another thing about the SSDT page remapping technique is that you can do it for only the process context of your currently controlled process. So PatchGuard does not detect that because they monitor that virtual address in the system process. There are some hardware mitigations that can block some of the attacks that I talked about, but they require having specific hardware. For example, kernel code enforcement technology is basically like control flow integrity for the kernel, and that will kill ROP attacks such as the thread context manipulation technique. And then there's also Intel V2 Rep that's supported by 12th generation Intel CPUs, which will block the page swapping technique that I just talked about. However, this one is not even implemented by Windows. From what I'm told, they're working on it, but it requires non-trivial design changes. And so ultimately, actually, all of the techniques that we've presented today are still possible, even with all of the virtualization-based security mitigations and supported hardware mitigations. This should be at least somewhat distressing to you if you were a defender. So what can defenders do? Our recommendation is taking advantage of all available protections, mitigations, virtualization-based, and hardware, but setting that up is not a user-friendly experience. We recommend constructing a policy with WDAC Wizard, the Windows Defender Application Control Wizard, and also outline some steps to make sure that you're enabling all the virtualization-based security mitigations that you can. And here's a list of toggles we recommend when constructing a policy. If you're interested, you can download the slides tomorrow and take a look. And that's all we got. We'll take questions now.
All right.
Hello. Excuse me,
Hi.
I want to ask the questions. So regarding to you, you're mentioning about blocking the telemetry of the EDRs. So do you find?
I'm sorry, I can't really hear you that well.
Yeah.
Hello, is that better?
I think so. Keep going.
Yeah, I'm just trying to ask about regarding to your point to blocking the telemetry for the EDR solutions. So are you doing it on the NDIS driver, or you're doing it with the WFP?
So what do you want to?
I didn't hear.
The blocking the EDR telemetry, like the network filtering.
Oh, for network filtering?
Yes.
Yeah, we're using WinDivert. What is the question exactly? Or so in WinDivert we can define either based on process or on source and destination.
I see your point.
Yeah.
I thought you was trying to do the driver yourself, so that was I was asking the question.
Oh.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. No more questions. We will also be around here at the stage if people want to come up and ask some questions, because I think we're the last session of the day.
Yeah, so you can just come up to the stage. I think it might be a little bit easier to hear it as well if you have questions.
Okay. All right.